بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم كتب عليكم الصيام كما كتب على الذين من قبلكم لعلكم تتقون. In the name of God, the most kind, the most merciful, it is truly part of God's grace and His blessing that we are fortunate enough to participate once again in this noble month of spirituality, the month of divine mercy and divine forgiveness, the month in which God is supposed to be our host and we are supposed to be His guests, the month in which the essence of the Holy Qur'an was revealed onto the heart of the Holy Prophet, the month in which we try to self-evaluate ourselves and to take account of how we are doing in our journey towards eternity and returning back to God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Many a times we get occupied with the hustle and bustle of daily activities, and the month of fasting is a time to pause, is a time to reflect, to contemplate, and to once again remind ourselves that there is a higher purpose for existence other than accumulation of material gains. Human beings by nature are weak. God says in the Quran, خُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا, human being has been created weak and fragile. The Quran also reminds us that human being is forgetful, and that is why there is a constant need for reminders, tadhakkur, and one of the primary functions of prophets and messengers is to merely remind us and reawaken our human conscience and to jolt us into remembering what is our true purpose and true mission of existence. Likewise, the month of fasting is a time to reawaken our moral, ethical, and spiritual dimensions of life. In the past 11 months, there's a tendency for human beings to regress, to fall back, and to become neglectful of some of our moral, ethical, and social obligations. For instance, it is not far-fetched to say that human beings fall into the traps of many spiritual diseases, like, for example, as I mentioned, forgetfulness of God, consumerism, materialism, ego worship, self-righteousness, jealousy, fanaticism, and so on. These are part and parcel of human frailties, and this month of fasting is supposed to be a time for us to work on some of our spiritual diseases and hopefully improve upon them. There is a tradition attributed to one of the Imams that a human being's 2 days should not be identical. That is to say, there has to be a constant evolution, a constant growth towards spiritual perfection. If the yesterday and today are identical, that means we have lost the precious commodity of time. We have not utilized this very valuable capital towards spiritual improvement, and therefore we are at a loss. And the hadith goes further and says, if today is worse than yesterday, then of course we are the losers because we have actually done harm to ourselves by the misutilization of time. The injunction of fasting, as you know, came after the migration of the Holy Prophet from Mecca to Medina. And it underlines that ibadat and acts of worship are intertwined with morals, ethics, and spirituality. That is, the foundation of religion was laid down in the period when the Prophet was in Mecca, and acts of worship are there to further solidify and help us in remaining steadfast to the foundational core values of religion. It says in the Qur'an, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe, kutiba alaykumus siyam, fasting has been made mandatory or obligatory upon you. Kama kutiba ala alladhina min qablikum, just as it was made compulsory upon those who came before you. لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, so that perchance, you will be able to attain this moral, ethical quality of taqwa. Taqwa is one of the most important ethical attributes in the Quran. It has multiple meanings, multiple translations. For example, some have translated taqwa as God consciousness, God awareness, reverential fear, social responsibility, social accountability, self-restraint, and so on. All of these meanings have a component of the totality of the meaning of taqwa. Taqwa means that you are somebody who is balanced in terms of your relationship with the creation of God horizontally. That means human to creation relationship, and then you're also on the point of balance and equilibrium when it comes to the vertical relationship that is between God and human beings. When you have this element of balance and equilibrium, then we say the person is at the point of taqwa. The verse continues and it says, Ayyaman ma'dudat. These are finite number of days. فَمَنْ كَانَ مِنْكُمْ مَرِيضًا أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ فَعِدَّةٌ مِنْ أَيَّامٍ أُخَرٍ. As for those who are sick or who are on a journey, for them there is no need to fast, but rather they should make up for the missed fast at some other future time. The point that I want to note here is that the purpose of fasting is not to inflict some kind of punishment or pain upon us, but rather the purpose of fasting is for spiritual growth and spiritual improvement and humility, and to sensitize ourselves to the plight of the poor and those who are the underprivileged and suffering. But the purpose is not to cause things that would be unhealthy for our body. And one of the questions that is commonly asked is that if the purpose of fasting is spiritual growth and God does not intend harm to us, and religion, God says, is supposed to be something easy and not so difficult, then the question is, what happens to people who have to fast for, let's say, 19 hours, 20 hours, those who are living in the Northern Hemisphere, let's say in Alaska or, I don't know, Iceland. And the Quranic verse says that one has to fast. He says, وَكُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَكُمْ. You have to continue, you can continue eating until the thread, that means the dawn and the dusk, the dawn becomes distinguishable. And therefore they say, since the Quran has mentioned dawn to dusk, and therefore the ruling should remain the same. So for example, if in Iceland, the dawn to dusk is 19 hours or so on, one has to remain faithful to this particular Quranic injunction. This is one of the issues dealing with Quranic interpretation, the theory of hermeneutics, the theory of how to interpret the Quran. There are some parts of the Quran that are supposed to be constant, unchanging, and immutable. And then there are other verses in the Quran that are bound by context, by society, by the historical context, by the geographical context. They are not trans-historical. And then it remains a challenge in your theory of interpretation to be able to distinguish verses that you think are supposed to remain constant, and then those verses that are supposed to be somehow contextual. This verse that talks about fasting from dawn to dusk, is it a verse that is universal, unchanging, applies to all places and all times? Or is it something that is bound by a particular geographical context? These are very difficult issues to resolve because the Quran does not indicate at times whether the verse is supposed to be contextual or it is supposed to be for eternity. For example, we have no indication in this verse that says, "Wakulu washrabu," eat and drink until you see this, the thread that distinguishes the appearance of the dawn. It doesn't say anything about whether this verse is supposed to be only for the Arabian Crescent, only the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, or it doesn't say it is not supposed to be restricted either. And therefore, this requires an amount of reflection, and also it requires for us to develop a theory of interpretation. And depending upon your theory of interpretation, it is going to define your outcome. For example, you will recall that when there was a vacancy in the Supreme Court during the time of the previous president, the Republican Party was very eager to replace the seat with somebody who holds on to that particular theory of interpretation of the Constitution that believes that one has to go back to the meaning the way it was understood by our framers of the Constitution. That is, the document is not something that is fluid. The document is not something that is subject to change depending upon time and context, but rather the document has an original meaning, the theory of originality. And therefore, a person who subscribes to that theory of interpretation, whether it is the American Constitution or the Quran, well, they would argue that this verse that says that you have to fast from dawn to dusk is something that is for perpetuity. It is not contextual. And therefore, regardless of where you are living, regardless of how many hours of fast one has to engage in, the verse is something that is universal and transcends time and space and geography, and therefore one has to fast 19 hours if it is so. And if one is unable to fast, they would say, for 19, 20 hours, then God has given us the exemption here in the Quran, which says if you are sick or if you're on a journey, or if you have some other kind of ailment or some kind of a justifiable reason, then you should not fast, and you can make it up at some other future time. And instead, you can give also some money towards charity and so on. So that is one theory of interpretation of the Constitution, also of the Quran. There's also another theory of interpretation when it came to the interpreting the Constitution, was that the Constitution is a document that is a living document. It is an evolving document, it's fluid. And therefore, we have to enter into the minds of the framers of the Constitution and ask, what was the intent when they drafted this particular section of the Constitution? What was their intent? Was the intent that this particular meaning is completely absolute without any kind of a context? Or was there some kind of an intent to further improve the welfare of society? So one has to ask the same question here when it comes to the verses dealing with the timings of fasting. Is that when God said that you can eat and drink until the appearance of dawn, is it something that was, the intent was that it should be universal? Or was the intent very specific, oriented towards the society that was in the Arabian Peninsula, and it was meant to be an X number of hours that is within the range of tolerance of human beings? For instance, some of our youngsters, they say that based upon scientific evidence. It says that if a person goes without any kind of liquid or fluid for 19 hours or 20 hours, it can be harmful to one's health. And we have a general ruling in Islam that says that anything that is harmful to a human being should be prohibited or is to be prohibited. So therefore, they want to argue is that this particular verse that says the dawn to dusk is something that was applicable to a particular geographical context, the Arabian Peninsula, but it is not to be universalized, but rather we have to look at the intent of God. What was the intention of instituting and mandating fasting? And God says in the Quran, the purpose why we have made this injunction obligatory upon you is لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, so that you will develop this ethical, moral, spiritual attribute of taqwa. So the end outcome is how to become a muttaqi, a God awareness, a God conscious, morally conscious human being. And if that is the aim, then is it possible for us to interpret, or at least have an interpretive theory of the Quran that is contextual? That is to say that it does not subscribe to the theory of originalism, but rather it is a theory of contextualism. That is, the context will define what is dawn to dusk. What I want to say is that all these issues are something to think about, and it all depends upon your theory of interpretation of the Quran. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.